Welcome to the Visible Policing Podcast, where we explore the nature and impact of the visual in relation to contemporary crime and policing. Hello, I'm Mike Rowe, Professor of Criminology at Northumbria University. I'm joined today by my colleague Liam Ralph, and we're going to talk about policing and social media. Liam, can you just begin perhaps by telling us a little bit about your own research into this area?
Yeah, certainly, Mike. So my own research is in a Scottish context. So I've been involved in research starting in 2015, looking at police use of social media in a Scottish context. A lot of my research is about the engagement side of things. So it's about how the police engage with citizens through social media. And again, as part of that, I kind of look at and have looked at how social media fits into everyday policing, so the kind of interactions that police officers and at times police staff have with citizens in physical spaces. So it's that kind of physical spaces and this online sphere as well that I have looked at, and it primarily started through my PhD starting in 2015, which I've submitted recently. So yeah, that's when it started.
So this is to do with the idea that there can be, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but is this to do with the idea that, you know, social media can be a kind of form of virtual policing, that it can give some sort of engagement with the public in ways that wouldn't otherwise be possible, and it's this kind of online presence is somehow equivalent to the kind of patrol function of policing? Is that the kind of broad area?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's really interesting. It's interesting you said virtual policing there as well, and for my own research, I know there's kind of in Scotland, and I think across the UK as well, we kind of have these virtual community policing teams. Now we kind of see emerging. So this idea that actually we engage with communities and different communities, and we recognise this in physical spaces. So we need to treat and recognise the virtual community as well, and so that kind of sits aside from it. So we kind of the virtual sits with how the police engage kind of every day with policing and in these kind of face-to-face communities as well. And you kind of touched there about the idea of patrol as well, which I also thought was quite interesting. You know, these kind of, what does that look like? How does that equate? Is it kind of police officers sitting by a computer as they're kind of scrolling through a home screen, you know, or whatnot? So what does patrol actually look like? And I think that's the interesting thing, is we just need to look at the literature. And again, my own kind of PhD probably confirms that as well, that a lot of it is one way. So we know that the way the police use social media, it's a one-way communication medium. So it's about the police communicating with citizens. So if it was a patrol, then it's certainly the police are visible. But yeah, in terms of the interactions, we don't kind of see that happening on social media, and there's certainly a whole host of kind of reasons and arguments for that. So yeah, it would be that.
It's a monologue more than a dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it's kind of the way I always talk about social media, and I kind of looked at the literature around it, was thinking about the different ways that the police can use social media. And so the first kind of way is this idea of a push strategy, and so it's the idea that the police can push information onto citizens. So whether that's, say, it could be a road closure, we want to tell you this is happening in this particular area, or indeed we have arrested so and so and they're now facing prosecution and so on as a result of that. So you're pushing information very much out onto the audience. The other kind of strategy, the second one, is this idea of a pull strategy. So you want to pull information back from citizens. So now the police would say we actually need their cooperation, their kind of engagement with us. And so for this, you could have something like a missing person, and how if somebody does go missing, then we want them to help us find this person. Have you seen so and so? Where are they? Can you give us any information about X that happened on Friday night in the town or city centre? So we actually want people to cooperate with us. And again, that for my own research kind of took its own challenges for the police, because if you're asking for people to cooperate and to provide you with information, then you're going to need an officer or a member of staff within the police behind that computer waiting for it. So it's no good putting something out, say, on a Friday, coming back to it, as there was an example I heard that, and you come back to it on a Monday morning and suddenly somebody's provided information, the person you said was missing was in the pub at this time, and no one sees that until 3 days later. So it kind of brings its own challenges then around resources within the police, that actually somebody needs to be there able to respond and to monitor this, I guess, in terms of the information that's coming in. So that's the second one, the push strategy. And the third one is this kind of dialogue. So the third way the police can use social media is to have conversations with people, is to open up this dialogue with citizens and other organisations, and facilitate the conversation through social media as part of that.
But you seem to be suggesting that dialogue, if there are three functions, the dialogue one was, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but was that the weakest of the three?
Yeah, it's the one we probably don't see happening as much. So we see it kind of being used as a push strategy and a pull strategy. So they will ask about missing persons and so on, and they will push information out onto the audience. But yeah, in terms of the dialogue, the conversation that happens, we don't see that so often. We kind of have examples where we'll have police forces across the UK have allocated particular dates and times and days that we will have that conversation with you, but then very much the conversation ends and we'll try and get back to you. And I think, that kind of points to some of the challenges for the police and I'm sure the argument, certainly when I was doing my research, was the scale of social media. So social media and actually trying to manage the responses that you do get, and maybe it's a case of not biting off more than you can chew at times. So if we start to open up this conversation and we use social media for that, then we need to make sure that, this would be the argument within the police, that we can sustain that conversation going forward, and actually there are people to do that. And with the challenges within policing already around resources, then that's a real difficulty, they would say. And quite often it was a case of, I think this was the really interesting part, was actually letting the conversation just run for itself. So quite often the police, through my own research, will be quite happy to start the conversation. So whether that means putting something out there and then kind of allowing citizens and users to have this thread thereafter where they debate and talk about this subject, as some people perhaps will criticise the police and other users will come in and defend and champion and support the police and actually put their argument across. So there was this kind of expectation sometimes within the police that actually we can sit back, we can just let this conversation we've started it, people are talking, we might monitor it, would be the argument within the police. We might review what's going on and what people are saying, but very much allowing citizens to have this conversation as we kind of take a step back is the interesting thing there, I would say.
And how conscious were the police themselves about these three different strategies? Did they tend to explicitly go for one or the other, or were they just kind of, are these categories that you've kind of extrapolated from the data, or were they different strategies that the police were conscious of themselves?
Okay, it was a paper, it was in Holland, I can't remember, I think it's Meyer and Tornveld, but so they came up with this idea of push and pull, and it's really interesting, when you look at the literature, this is what I could kind of discern from this. Actually, a lot of the literature kind of fits within these categories, whether it's about push and pull and or having that dialogue. But in terms of the police, that's an interesting question you ask, and it probably went down to how social media is embraced, I would say, by the actual individuals. So quite often, if I found that from doing my own research, that if say somebody wasn't that comfortable using social media, if it wasn't their if they perhaps had been told to use social media, this is now going to become part of your role, and there was an expectation pushed on them to start engaging through social media, then at times you could see the push strategy coming into it. So it was about, okay, I'm not going to have a conversation with people on here because I don't know what that'll look like. That opens up these whole kind of loads of risks that might come from that. So, but I'm quite happy to tell people I was at this event, here's a photo, there's my little message at this event, PC so-and-so, and I'll leave it. And then maybe next week when I'm at another event, PC so-and-so at this other event, and I'll put it out on social media. And again, it goes down to how social media was embraced and kind of viewed within the police. Whereas those who were perhaps a little bit more, they embraced it more, but perhaps seen the opportunities kind of at times to have that dialogue and were perhaps a little bit more confident as well to use social media, would engage in it that way. And they were, and in terms of how they saw risk as well, they were kind of a little bit more open to that and actually accepting of some of the risks that comes with social media, but very much putting the opportunities above that. So in order to make most of the use of social media would be the argument there, I guess.
It seems a bit kind of hit and miss in a sense, that it depends on the proclivities of the individual police officer.
Yeah.
Were there any kind of policy guidelines or documentation or training or anything like that around any of this, or was it really just left to individuals to to pick it up and run with it in whichever way they want, or however far or short they wanted to go,
Yeah, that's if I can answer both of them, because there's probably 2 points there. The idea that it's kind of a hit and miss, and it just kind of it depends on who's using it, almost, is very much the case. And I mean, when I started my research, I always thought it was interesting that, especially when I did my field work with the police, that there was this kind of perception that, we just need to give social media to the younger officers. The younger officers get social media, they grew up with social media, they are the ones who embrace it. And suddenly you go and, I find, you go and speak to these younger officers, and it's, I'm not using social media. What do you mean? Why would I take on this? I've been in the police X amount of months or years, and I've just started. So they actually saw the risks with social media. So age to me was, but again, there still was this perception: give it to these younger officers who get it and are down with the kids, so to speak. So in terms of years in the police and so on, actually sometimes it was about the individual who perhaps embraces social media as opposed to their anything else kind of going on. And I mean, some of the people that I, through my own research, who embraced social media, perhaps you would say the most, were actually some of the older officers who really embraced it and really went for it. And then just on your second point around policy, so my research was in a Scottish context, where I, at the time, it was kind of being developed. So in Scotland, we have police divisions, so we have one police force, so that's Police Scotland, and we also have a number of divisions as well. So it was interesting because you've kind of got that mix between this kind of national outlook in terms of how Police Scotland want to use social media, but also the divisions as well, and how they kind of contribute to that national picture, but also take on some of the local things and issues as well. So policy was kind of driven, I would say, based on both those kind of levels. You had the national, perhaps, which was more policy, and the local was about how it was interpreted, and actually, wait a minute, this is what our division looks like, this is how we're going to use it. So just thinking about, in terms of who uses social media, again, is an interesting one, because we kind of have an array of people within the police who can and do engage with police accounts. So we have police staff and police officers, so we start to really kind of see the relationships within the police amongst these persons. So if I think of my first case study area, which I refer to in my thesis and my work as Inchloch, then in Inchloch you had media staff taking a real kind of hold on social media, and they were the kind of gatekeepers that everything that came in and went out. Whereas if I think about my second case study area, which was Dromald, in Dromald it was officer led, so the officers took a real hold and grasp of social media, and they were the ones governing and directing how social media would be used. So, and I think that just kind of shows some of how it was used differently across the areas.
Could you see, I mean, I don't know if it was possible to even look at this really, but could you see differences in terms of the impact or the appearance on whether it was officer led or whether it was the media and comms people, or did that make any difference in the practical sense, do you think?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, when I talked, I obviously spent time and talked to both of these kind of the media people involved in police use of social media and the officers as well. And in terms of how they saw it, I actually find they talked about the same sort of things, just addressing them differently. So might have police officers saying, I'm a police officer, I get frontline policing, I get the kind of risks that go into that, and I know when I communicate XYZ, then this is what it does to the officer. But again, similarly, you would have media people kind of saying, I know the risks that go into engaging with the traditional media. I know the risks that if we start putting things out on social media. So I found actually at times they were perhaps packaged differently in terms of who the individual is, but often they were associated with risks. Often they kind of came, maybe it's a case for actually both, of something to bring to the table in terms of how the police use social media. But certainly and the arguments were broadly similar as well, I would say. I don't think there was a lot of times where they were actually bringing something that was perhaps different. They both seen the risks that were associated with it, and I think that's perhaps the biggest difference, and the thing that we really need to focus on is how people are perhaps risk averse or risk positive when it came to social media. That was where we started to see the real differences. Right. So somebody who was risk averse, whether you were media or officer, would be very kind of cagey around what you communicate and how you use social media, whereas somebody who was perhaps a bit more risk positive certainly would be happy to open it up and whether that's officer or staff. So I think their actual background in discipline perhaps didn't, it was a bit later on. It was actually to the individual and how they approached it.
No, I'm interested in that point about risks. What were the nature of the risks that they tended to identify? In particular, I suppose I'm thinking about whether or not you found that they were conscious of internal risks, that they do something that their bosses would find unacceptable in some way. Was that the nature of the risks, or was it more organisational in terms of, I don't know, maybe giving out information that shouldn't be disclosed? Or tell me a bit more about what kind of risks
what the risks were. Yeah, I mean, it probably goes back to kind of what I said previously as well, around the kind of how media and officers saw it. So they would both talk about corporate risk, whether you were a police officer and staff, along those lines. It may not be exactly corporate risk, as perhaps media persons would say. So that was certainly what they kind of both would see there. That actually, can this do damage to our brand, damage to our reputation? What does this do to the, say in Scotland, where my research was, the Police Scotland brand, when people come and search for us and find us on social media, if we're seen in terms of how we use it. And again, that becomes the important part then, is around how social media is used in the police, and that was where the kind of corporate reputation was therefore seen within that. So yeah, it would be along those lines. So you had kind of people saying, and the argument would be around whether it's formal or informal communication styles. So this idea that actually we just need to get the message out onto social media, we need to say what happened, who was there, or along those lines, keep it very simple. It needs to be formal. We are the idea perhaps that we are the police, we are a trusted source of information, that what we put out there needs to be verbatim, it needs to be accurate, and we need to really make sure that we can get these points across. Whereas the other kind of side of it suggested a more kind of informal communication style, which is around, we can perhaps use humour, local dialect, we can perhaps change our words a little bit more. It doesn't have to be the same kind of verbatim text that we do each time. It doesn't need to be perhaps a police officer standing there with black polished boots and his overalls and whatnot, stood in front of a camera, but actually we can be a bit more engaging. And this is where the kind of the debates at times happened within the police in terms of how they saw it.
And that style of engagement could be in push, pull, or dialogue, could it? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I think most often we see it possibly through the push, I would say. So in terms of how we push information out, because again, a lot of the times we know it's not about dialogue. So again, we just need to look at police accounts, and we probably won't see that. And again, there are reasons I would like to say for that as well. That a lot of the time they're not asked questions. Perhaps through it's more statements, perhaps. So yeah, it would be the push side of things that we'd see. People would talk about dancing cops, and if dancing cops are Christmas jumpers and hats that aren't police related, and Santa hats and so on. So it's these kind of styles and how they are seen within the police, and what that does for the corporate reputation. And you would have arguments in favour of both sides. Actually, if we wear a Christmas hat when it's Christmas time, perhaps some people within the police, and certainly my study, would say fantastic. We're engaging with communities. We, again, kind of my research drew on Ben Bradford's work, a lot of it, and it was this kind of expressive style of the police and how that kind of manifests itself through police communications. So actually the police and communities are the same, and police officers themselves, whenever they kind of can tap into that and be seen to represent the community and be symbolic in the kind of function they play in that sense, then Christmas hats kind of could deliver that around Christmas time. And the other side would say, well, no, because then the risk comes into it. We are the police, we're there to tackle crime and fight the bad guys, so to speak, and by wearing Christmas hats, what are we doing to victims of crime and people who have been affected by crime? And we're coming away from what our function is, which is to tackle
And what's
crime.
The evidence then about, so those different perspectives were from police officers and staff.
Yeah.
What was the evidence about how, or what is the evidence about how the public actually see all of that? Because what you've described there, that's based on a kind of subjective view of what they anticipate the public reaction to be.
Yeah.
Is there evidence about what the actual reality of that public reaction is?
Well, I think that's the problem, to be honest with you, a lot of the time, because if it is that kind of if it's just about how it's seen within, without that kind of realisation about how it is seen out with. And again, that was part of my literature, and to my own thesis was a big thing that I wrote about, was the kind of, from a community policing outlook, that itself kind of suggests that it needs to be locally led. If you have local police officers who perhaps get their communities, understand their communities, and again, it's very difficult when you think about a virtual community and who you're communicating with, but again, kind of showing that these officers should be involved in that process if they understand their communities and perhaps know the relationship they already have with their communities. Because we've had examples, if I think of in America, there was an example a few years ago where one police force asked their followers to send photos with cops, and the idea was that actually they didn't have a good relationship in physical spaces, face to face with communities, so what they got out on social media was just, they were ridiculed, people really challenged them, they were criticised because they didn't have that kind of a relationship in the physical space. So again, if we have these officers who understand, who get their communities, and again, hopefully through community policing they do, then they kind of have a role to play in terms of perhaps how and what their audiences expect. But again, there's not a lot of research on how people respond to social media. Most of the research, most of the literature, and again, we probably need to move beyond this, is about how they use social media. Again, I talked about push, so whether it's traffic, whether it's missing persons, whether it's a wanted person, and so on. So what we really need to be looking at is how people respond. I did it through my own research, so I had focus groups with communities across Scotland. It's certainly my 2 case study areas I looked at in terms of how they respond to it, and it's actually something that we're going to be looking at hopefully as part of our visible policing project, as well as we look at how people, I should say, I'm involved in the visible policing project as well, and it'll be about how people respond to the visual aspects of police communication.
What were your findings from the Scottish case then? You talked about the focus groups. I mean, what kind of themes came from there in terms of citizen perceptions of the role of the police on social media?
Yeah, I mean, I started off thinking about how does it compare? How does it compare amongst police officers, police staff and citizens? But I actually found myself saying that there's differences within these, and actually there's similarities across all three. So again, you kind of asked me before about police officers kind of versus police staff. What were the differences there? But actually a lot of it were similarities. You had police staff who embraced it, police staff that didn't, police officers that did, police officers that didn't. And again, the same sort of thing happened amongst citizens. You would have citizens who kind of say, yeah, great, fantastic, the idea of police officers with Christmas hats around the festive period is fantastic, absolutely what I want to see. And you would have others saying, absolutely not, this is not what when I go into my social media feed I expect to see. So again, it kind of highlights the similarities amongst how police officers and citizens and staff, they all kind of viewed it within. So in terms of an approach going forward, it probably highlights some of the challenges for the police. It doesn't mean to say that, my research would say, it doesn't mean to say you put out a funny tweet and suddenly you're going to increase your following and everybody will love you. Some perhaps will, but again, we know some perhaps won't. Again, which is why this kind of community policing side of it comes into it. It has to be about the local then. How will your local community respond? And again, I would imagine that there perhaps be differences amongst people at the same time as well there.
So it sounds as though it's not a sort of silver bullet. It's not going to improve community relations somehow, or replace. I mean, I suppose one of the unstated assumptions might be that you can make up for a lack of officers actually out there on the streets, as it were, by having a stronger profile on social media, as though there's some kind of trade-off between the two. You seem to be suggesting that's a bit simplistic, is it? Yeah,
I think so, and I think also it's about, I kind of probably tapped into it a little bit earlier, just around the relationship within those physical spaces, so in face-to-face, and what that kind of looks like, and how social media, you can't just be perhaps failing at one and expect the other one to come in and kind of improve your relationship with community. So if I think about my first case study area, Inchloch, when I spent time there, they had a police station. The police station was symbolically open, so there were few officers inside the police station. It was open to the community to kind of be seen as the police weren't going anywhere, they would still be there, but there was still this perception amongst citizens within this area that we know that police station's not used, we know they've kept it open, but it's not really open. I can't go in, the police sign is still outside, but it doesn't really go much further than that. And again, that was a lot of what they would talk about as well, was actually what their relationship was like. So I would go round, some people would say, I would hand in letters when I went away on holiday to tell the police that I was going away, can they look after my house, and I can no longer do that anymore. Or we have events here and that's the only time, so there was a music festival in this particular place that would happen. It was a small place, and it was a Scottish folk festival. Then that's when we see the police. So actually what they talk about a lot of the time, it isn't just about the police online, it's about the police in these physical spaces. And I think there has to be this joined up approach between the two. It can't just be one, we're perhaps failing in one and we've got all these challenges in these kind of physical spaces. Okay, we'll just use social media. And actually no, because when I did my research, people talk about the both. They don't discern between the police online and the police in community, the police in the face-to-face, but actually they will debate across these. Was certainly what I found.
Fascinating stuff. I know you'll have seen relatively recently in the late summer of 2019 that in England and Wales, the government have promised an increase of 20,000 police officers over the next few years, and quite soon after the announcement, the Home Secretary said that she hoped or urged that police forces would be employing, police officers on patrol rather than social media staff. I just thought it would be interesting as we come to the end of the discussion.
Yeah.
What's your view of that? Do you think she's right to make that point, or is she wide of the mark? What's your take on this debate as a result of your own research findings, do you think?
Yeah, as in what should it look like? Should police officers be behind a computer? Should they be out there in communities? I think it depends on the community. I don't think there could be a blanket rule across the whole. Say, my research was in Scotland. If you were to think about Scotland and say, right, okay, we're going to have this amount. If I take one good area, so somewhere like Shetland, where it's a series of communities, series of areas, and actually how it can be very difficult perhaps for officers because it is islands, to get to each of these islands, then you would imagine in somewhere like Shetland to say, okay, police officers should be out on the beat. Then what does what she said equate? How does that equate to somewhere like Shetland? Is she going to put a police officer in each single island? Or are the police now going to have boats up there where they can move between the islands? Possibly not. So actually somewhere like that, social media can fit in, and it can be actually beneficial if you've got an officer perhaps operating from the central part and can use social media to engage with these different communities, and how it can be virtual in that sense. And again, my research was in Scotland. Scotland, we already know, is a largely highland area, and we've only really got, I think, the population of the people around the east coast and kind of Glasgow, Edinburgh, central belt. So we do have these kind of hard to reach communities kind of out there. So social media can certainly tap in that. So yeah, I think to have a blanket statement like social media kind of has no place and its officers on the beat. I think there was certainly support when I did my own research from citizens for the police using social media and how they want to see that. Yeah, there was criticism, but the criticism really was small. I mean, overwhelmingly, my research with communities highlighted the support.
Liam, thank you very much indeed. We could talk about this for a long time, and there's lots of other areas we could get into, but that was really fascinating. Thanks very much indeed.
Hey, thanks very much for having me, Mike. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you. This podcast is produced as part of an Economic and Social Research Council funded study, Visible Policing. For more information, visit visiblepolicing.com.